You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke McKenna, but today's case is the crazy case of Kurt Sova. This is one that Selena Gomez herself investigated. Now, this is a boy whose case would spiral into many different theories, but would still have no answers. There were rumors of possible deception and cover-ups, but it was still unsolved. However, just this year, this case would be thrown into the spotlight in a huge way, and we seem to be getting closer and closer to the truth. By the way, I post so much content like this. It is my absolute passion to tell these stories, and I mean absolutely no harm or disrespect when I do so. So if it's something you would like to support me in, all you have to do is make sure you are subscribed down below, give this video a thumbs up, and leave a nice comment down below. Now let's get back to the story. So it was 1981 in Ohio, and the Sova family lived in Newburgh Heights. This was Ken and Dorothy, who were the parents, and they had 4 younger boys. Well, obviously younger, they had 4 boys as children, and the youngest child was actually a 17-year-old named Kurt. Now they lived in a quiet, peaceful town. It wasn't the best town, but they definitely made the best of it. And on the True Crime Chronicles podcast, the siblings would talk about how, since there were 4 of them, they were almost the equivalent of a small football or baseball team, and they kind of acted like it as well. They were always active and always either fighting or playing with one another, doing something that was competitive. Kurt was a healthy, tough, good kid who listened to his parents and who kind of got a little freedom because he was the baby of the family. He would be allowed to go out at night, but he had kind of an unwritten curfew of 10:30 p.m. to 11 p.m. and this is just when he would always come home. So it was kind of like a self-inflicted curfew, but he was never later than that, and if he was, he would call, make sure they knew where he was and why he was going to be late, because his father Ken was originally part of the military, and so he kind of took some of those habits that he had formed to teach his boys how to act. So they were all really good, well-mannered boys, and Kurt knew that although he didn't have a whole bunch of rules, he still needed to be a good boy, a good son, and do as he was told. His parents had a great relationship with him, and they trusted him fully, and of course the baby of the family does get a little more freedom, and the parents are a lot more lenient and relaxed on what they will allow, and so Kurt kind of had the best of both worlds. He had his brothers and he had parents who loved him, but he also didn't have the strictness that I'm sure his oldest brother had. And he also had a nickname of Mousy because he was always squawking, squeaking, talking. Even when he was younger, he just loved to make people laugh and kind of be the center of attention. And he also loved sports and fishing, and his 4 brothers would always had given him kind of a hard time, and they liked to mess with him, they liked to play around with him. But it was also that kind of relationship where they could mess with them, but nobody else could, and they would stick up for him when it came to anybody else because nobody else was allowed to mess with him. But at the same time, Kurt had these 3 brothers that would do anything for him, but because they were messing with him, they also made him stand up for himself, and he was able to not just be a victim or the baby in this scenario. He was able to be strong and cared for as well. However, that October 23rd, everything would change because Kurt would leave his house that afternoon. It was a Friday, and he had planned to go to a local carnival that night to hang out, and he went up to meet with a friend named Samuel C. Carroll. And at this point, Samuel kind of brought up to Kurt that there was a party at a duplex in Newburgh Heights, and that they were invited to go by mutual friends if they wanted to, so they decided this would be more fun. This was only a few blocks from Kurt's home on Harvard Avenue, and so they had new plans and they were very excited to go. They knew that they would be meeting up with people they kind of knew, but they weren't directly friends with yet. They were a little bit older, so they headed to this small place that was crowded with drunk individuals everywhere. And of course, these boys who were only 17 and couldn't buy themselves alcohol, they were a little excited that there was so much there because the older people could buy it. And so they were drinking along with everybody, and they were having a great time. But Kurt would never return home at his curfew. He would never return home at all. 11 o'clock came and went, and his parents knew something was wrong as soon as 11 o'clock struck because, like I said, he was always on time. He was extremely good, and he cared about making people not anxious and making his parents know that they could trust him. So him not coming meant something was wrong, and his parents started going out to search for him, and they couldn't find him anywhere. And they hadn't known that he had gone to this party because he had originally said he had gone to the carnival. They were searching the neighborhood. Nobody knew where he was. They obviously didn't make it to this duplex because they didn't know that it existed or the party had been there. And so once it became too late in the night to search, they went to sleep, woke up the next morning, and Dorothy, his mother, started calling all of his friends that she could think of to get some information, while Ken went out and searched the neighborhood once again. From this, they weren't really getting him any information on where he had been because, of course, this party he had been at had not been with his immediate friends. They were much older individuals, so none of his true friends knew where he was. By that Sunday, Dorothy and Ken were absolutely devastated. They couldn't find him anywhere. He hadn't contacted them, and they decided it was time to go to the police and report him missing. And Dorothy was, after doing that, was already back to the search, and she was searching dumpsters, alleyways, and even the haunted house attraction that was in the area, thinking maybe something happened in there and nobody had found him yet. And it was almost Halloween, so there was a lot of decorations out and creepy stuff, so I just imagine it was extremely hard to search for him in a place that was already filled with skeletons and blood and gore, and that I'm sure made it even more traumatic coming across these things and not knowing if it was a decoration or if it was your son. She feared that Kurt had been hurt and was in need of help, and she wanted to give him that help. And so she was not letting up on anyone she was talking to. She was really hounding any of his friends, anyone in the area, to tell her what they knew, because she knew someone knew something. And that is when she began to hear rumors. And these were of a party that had happened at a local duplex. Once she heard this, she headed to the duplex, knocked on the door, and asked to talk to the owner of the house. And this lady who opened the door said that she was just the babysitter. The owner wasn't there. And so Dorothy started saying, "Can you tell me if there was a party here? Can you tell me if Kurt Sova was here?" And this babysitter said, "Look, I don't know anything." And so Dorothy gave her her number and said, "Please have the owner call me as early as possible," and then she left. Now, the owner's name was Debbie Sams, and this was actually changed in the Unsolved Mysteries segment that did this case as well to Susan, but her real name is Debbie Sams, and she rented this apartment with her brother named Clayton, and they also had a roommate named Missy at the time. Just when Dorothy was at a loss for where to go next, she would get a call from Debbie that night, and Debbie would tell her she didn't have a party that night, and Kurt wasn't there, and she hadn't seen him at all. Dorothy had completely believed Debbie and really thought that there was no party that had happened. However, then a pizza delivery man would come forward saying there had been a party that night because he had delivered pizzas there, and he had seen Kurt himself at this location. And at this point, Dorothy knew she had been lied to. But why? Why did Debbie not want her to know that there had been a party? And where was her son? She called Debbie back and she demanded the truth. And that is when Debbie would finally admit that there had been a party, Kurt had been there, and she had lied. At this point, more information began to surface that Kurt had been drinking quite a bit at this party, and actually the Friday that he went missing, before he went to this actual party, it was a school day, and he had apparently skipped school to buy alcohol or go to a store and ask an adult to buy it for him, and he would spend the day drinking at his girlfriend's house. The drink he was consuming was 190 proof Everclear, which was said to be an extremely strong drink, one that is banned in 14 states for being fatal. If this was true, that would mean that Kurt had been drinking all day and all night long. And this was strange to his friends and family because they said he wasn't much of a drinker. I mean, of course, a lot of underage teenagers will participate in drinking at parties, even though it is illegal. And so they weren't shocked that he drank, they were just shocked that he drank that much or had allegedly been doing so. That is when they began to question the friend that Kurt had gone to the party with, Samuel. Samuel would say that the night of the party, Kurt was drinking so heavily that he was falling, he was feeling sick, and that is when Samuel would take him outside to get some air after Debbie had asked him to take him out because he was knocking things over and causing this huge scene. And so Samuel would take him outside for 20 to 30 minutes, and it was pretty chilly when they were out there, and so neither of them had a jacket on, so Samuel decided to go back in and grab their jackets so neither of them would freeze to death. And he said he was inside for 2 to 3 minutes to grab their jackets, but when he came back where Samuel had been kind of leaning against a fence, he was now gone, and Samuel couldn't find him anywhere. Samuel said he walked around the nearby streets and in a vacant parking lot to see if he had just stumbled out of the area and still needed help, but when Samuel didn't find him, he thought that maybe Kurt just started to walk home, or maybe he had gotten a ride with someone who had passed by because everyone in the area knew each other, and so he decided to go back into the party. Samuel said, "I can only guess that someone he knew picked him up because it happened that fast. Someone had to pick him up in a car. Yet if they did, they wouldn't be dropping him back off at home." That is when Dorothy and Ken decided that they were going to find answers, and they would do it on their own if they had to, no matter what, to find where their son was. It was now 3-4 days of him being missing, and nobody had a clue where he was, even though they had been with him that Friday night. So they began to go over to this duplex multiple times, knocking on the door, asking questions, and weren't really getting anywhere with Debbie at all. And that is when they were getting fed up. And Ken would go over with his other 3 sons, and they would kick down the door. And they would go inside and they would begin their own search. And this is when they allegedly found Kurt's jacket inside because he had left it there. The question was, why didn't Sam just take it home with him when he had obviously said he had it to take it back outside to warm Kurt up? Of course, this wasn't legal for the family to be doing without being under the police with a search warrant, and so when Debbie called the police department saying that the Sova family broke in to her apartment, they were of course in trouble, and they would have no choice, the police department would have no choice but to order them to cease any more attempts to visit this apartment. And the chief police, James F. Lucas, would tell them, if you do it again, we'll have to pursue a case in harassment against you guys. And I'm sure that at this time they were feeling even more betrayed, the Sova family, because they weren't getting a ton of help in the investigation of their missing son, and now they were going to be charged with harassment for trying to find him. And no, it's not okay to be breaking in, but I can see how that torture of not knowing and nobody doing anything could lead you to that point of just feeling like that is your last option. So the search continued, but now away from the place that Kurt was last seen, and 30 or to 50 volunteers would go out from the community to help search, because this was a pretty small community that they lived in, but they were finding nothing. And At this point, it was now Monday, October 26th, 4 days after he had vanished, and nobody knew where Kurt was, but something strange would occur. This was at the Slavic Village Records, which was a store that, of course, was a stylish place to go find music, and was very popular in the area. And inside there was a missing persons poster of none other than Kurt Sova. And that is when a homeless man would walk inside and bring even more questions to the forefront of this investigation. Because what he would say to the cashier was not anything that she had expected. She was told by this homeless man, who pointed at Kurt's poster, they're going to find him, and they're going to find him in 2 days, and they're not going to know what happened to him. And then he proceeded to tell her that she could take down the poster because she knew what was going to happen. The cashier's name at the store was Judy, and she didn't tell anyone about this at first because she had known that there was a homeless man in the area. It was most likely him, who had been really talking nonsense, and he had these elaborate stories. He even told lots of people that he would break into the Cleveland Hopkins International Airport, and he had access to bodies flown in there, and that he would steal their shoes. And so many people just thought that he was the crazy homeless man in town and did not listen to anything he said. However, they should have listened at this point. This wouldn't be the only odd thing to happen that day either, because one of Kurt's friends named David Tresnick would be driving down the road about a mile away from where Kurt's home was, and he was going to a job interview. However, he saw 2 boys walking down the street, and he said that he recognized one of them as being Kurt. And so he kind of pulled over and was going to give him a ride, knowing that Kurt didn't have a car. However, as soon as he pulled over, he was about to call out for him when Kurt was actually walking the opposite direction, and he called out the name Franko. And after this, him and the boy that was with him that David didn't know would run to a van on the opposite side of the road and jump in with them as they drove away. Now, David didn't know who this was, but he also hadn't realized yet that Kurt was a missing person. So he didn't follow that van. He didn't confirm that this was Kurt, and he had no idea he had possibly just seen a missing boy. Now, when David finally saw that Kurt was missing, he came forward apologizing like crazy, saying that he would have come forward sooner. He would have done anything he could to track him down if he would have known that he was missing, and that he was pretty much beating himself up because he may have been the last person to see Kurt. Now, at this point, I'm sure that Dorothy and Ken were having a hard time sleeping anyways, but they would be woken up at 3 a.m. the next morning because their phone was ringing, and Dorothy would answer, and she would be greeted by none other than Debbie Sams. Debbie would begin to tell her that there was a boy in her basement sleeping, and that it may be Kurt. And this is an extremely odd statement for the duplex owner, who had originally lied twice before admitting the truth. Dorothy didn't know whether to believe Debbie or whether this was just another lie, but she also wasn't going to sit there and not do anything if her son was just simply sleeping in the basement. So she sent Ken over to go search, and he would go in to the basement, he would turn on the light, and he would find nothing. Well, not any humans. He actually did find a cot with a pillow and blanket that looked as though it had been slept in, but nobody was there. He went home disappointed as ever, knowing he would have to tell his wife that he was not there. And the only good thing was they would not have to wait too much longer to find where their boy had gone. It was now Wednesday, October 28th at 5:30 p.m. when some school children were out walking in a ravine near the JL Furniture Warehouse when they would come across something that they were not expecting at all, and that no child should have to see. This was the body of a boy positioned in a puddle amongst trash, and His face was turned to the side, and it appeared as though he'd been positioned, and his arms were stretched out, and one leg was posed up on the other, and both of the boy's shoes were missing. However, his left shoe would be found about 12 feet away from him in some brush. His right foot had a sock on, but his left foot did not. And something they immediately noticed when coming to the crime scene was that there was not a ton of dirt on his feet. And there was a ton of dirt and mud in this ravine. So if he had walked there, there's no way he could have done it barefoot. This body would be identified as Kurt Sova, and it would be found 500 meters from the very duplex he was last seen at. Now, this was 5 days after he vanished, and this was also an area where truck drivers frequented, so they also wanted to talk to some of them, because when Kurt's parents found out about this, they were of course devastated and heartbroken, but they were also confused because Ken had searched that very area of the ravine 24 hours earlier and had seen nothing, and he searched it incredibly closely, and no bodies were there. So it appeared as though this body had been placed there within those 24 hours. And the truck drivers in the area were talked to, and they said, no, we would have noticed something, but we didn't see a thing. It was quickly noticed that Kurt's state was quite odd. I mean, there was no sign of injuries yet. Of course, they would still need to do an autopsy, but so far all they saw were bruises and scratches, and nothing like that what they expected when being called after a body being found. It was as though those were things that any boy would have on their body. So why was he lying deceased? They expected a bloody, brutal crime scene, and this was anything but. Now, the Lieutenant Robert Carras would say, "It is our belief his body was dumped out there, and whoever the person or persons were knew the area. And they knew people go back there and ride dirt bikes, and kids play back there, so they knew that eventually, within a certain amount of time, that he would be found." Kurt would be taken to the coroner's office to get an autopsy done by Lester Alderson, who was well known and well respected in the area for his work, and Lester would find that Kurt's time of death had been 24 to 36 hours prior to being found. A day and a half. But this was strange considering he had been missing for 5 days. So what had happened during that time? Where had he been? And also the biggest question was, what caused his death? They could not determine an actual cause, so it was ruled probable instantaneous physiological death, meaning a probable accidental, and that was written on his death certificate. Lester claimed that the test showed Kurt hadn't been beaten or traumatized. There was no pre-existing disease that would have killed him. They even looked into his blood alcohol test to see if he had had a lethal dose of alcohol. His was at a 0.11 percentage, and the fatal percentage is 0.40. He was nowhere close. He would have been severely intoxicated for a 17-year-old small boy, but it wasn't deadly. There was also no sign of LSD or cocaine in his system. He seemed like a healthy boy who had died for no reason. Lester said, like Sherlock Holmes said, you eliminate all other possibilities, and that which remains is the truth. The truth was, nothing had been found to show how Kurt had died or why. His parents were devastated at this, needing to know what had happened for their peace of mind, but they also didn't know if they wanted to know who did this to him because it would be too much for them. She just wanted to know what had happened, and the police weren't really helping because this wasn't considered a crime, so there was nothing to investigate in their eyes. Well, do you remember the strange homeless man we talked about? Well, this isn't where the story ends with him, because now we know his statement to Judy had come true. Nobody knew what happened to Kurt, exactly how he had predicted, or how he knew it was going to turn up. And there was something I didn't tell you about him. You see, Judy would go into work the day that Kurt would be found murdered or deceased, and she would find a bouquet of flowers. There was a note inside that said, "Roses are red, the sky is blue. They found him dead, and they'll find you too." Judy was so freaked out by this point that she finally decided to contact the police and tell them what had all been happening with this homeless man. And when Judy came forward to the police, Kurt had not yet been found, and so they tracked this man down, they brought him in, they questioned him, they found out he was from Detroit, but not that he had anything to do with Kurt's disappearance, and they let him go. However, there are different statements on what actually happened, because there's that statement saying that before Kurt was found, that he was brought in, the homeless man questioned and released. However, some say that he was actually picked up after Kurt was found. The police knew that he had been correct in his prediction of how Kurt would be found. However, he would still be released. They had released this man allegedly because he was just an oddball who really didn't have anything to do with it and could cause no harm. However, whatever the real timeline of events was, they had released him and now they couldn't find him anywhere. He had vanished. And he had been there for weeks prior to Kurt's disappearance and death. They were now panicking, believing that they had possibly released a killer. And these sources were actually found by the Trail Went Cold podcast with being conflicting, and these two timelines are very, very pertinent to this case because it shows whether the police were either just being negligent or that they really did just release this man who they thought was out of his mind because there was no body yet to tell them he was correct. It would really be beneficial to know what was the truth, but we don't. Kurt's mother, Dorothy, believes that her son was dead when he was lying in the cot in the duplex basement. When Debbie called her, he was still there, and she somehow was feeling this sort of remorse, so she called his parents. However, when everybody else found out, or maybe when she panicked, they got rid of his body. And this would explain why when Kent went and searched this ravine, he wasn't there, and then 24 hours later he would be found, because they had dumped his body within that time frame because they were scared. Then 3 months later, another boy in the area would go missing. He was 13-year-old Eugene Kvet, and he had vanished between January 27th to the 28th in 1982, and he was wearing a white or gray coat, but he would also be found 4 to 5 days after on February 1st in a ravine 2.5 miles from where Kurt had been found. This was on the same street, and Eugene would be found only with cuts and bruises, with his right shoe missing that was never found, and Eugene's cause of death could not be found either. It was ruled to be from falling in the ravine. However, they couldn't really say for certain whether that was an accidental fall, whether he had been pushed, or whether he had been thrown after he was already deceased. Sounds a lot like Kurt's death, huh? Well, it was found that these two boys actually lived about a block away and had known each other when they were younger. So there was a connection as far as a personal one. But was there one in their death as well? Because both of these cases are still unsolved. A woman named Angeline Reddix would come forward later on in this investigation saying that she had witnessed something peculiar. This was that prior to Kurt being found, she had seen 2 males dragging a body toward a ravine, and this looked to be like an unconscious teenager. And she really just believed that they were drunk. It was the middle of the day, so she thought maybe they'd had an, night partying the night before, and this was 2 friends taking their friend home. So she didn't tell anyone what she had seen, but when she heard that Kurt had been found dead without his right shoe, she realized she had seen this teenager, the unconscious one, without his right shoe as well. At this point, she was too scared to tell anyone, and she knew she would eventually need to, but This would take her 8 years, and apparently when she went to investigators to tell them this, they never really got back to her. The case was still unsolved and she figured she could help, but nobody seemed to want to talk to her about it. So when she ran into the Sova family out and about, a little while later, she took it into her own hands and told them what she had seen, and this was the first time they had heard about it, so police hadn't told them anything, and the Sova family tried to reach out to the police as well to tell them there was more evidence, but nothing was done through them either. Angeline would say, "I seen them taking a boy down the alley. It was just before Halloween. One foot was barefoot. I'm almost sure it was the right one. I figured couple teenagers with a couple beers too many, and they're probably trying to sober up." It was now 8 years after the murder, and Kurt's parents still didn't know much more than they had from the time that he had gone missing, before he was even found, and they had searched for so long, questioned so many people, but they still didn't know what had happened. And Dorothy said she'll never give up searching for her son, because it's not a normal thing for a healthy boy to just vanish for 5 days and end up dead in a ravine. That's not something that just happens. Something else occurred here. She was interviewed for the Unsolved Mysteries segment, and she said that if that program didn't do anything to help her find answers, she would continue to search, and she wasn't going to stop. Unfortunately, Kurt's parents have since passed, with the answers to their son's death not being shown, not being found, and not even being looked for at that point, besides by them. And Kurt's brother Kevin is actually now the only surviving member of the family, and he's kind of taken over what his mother and father were trying to do. He said, "When somebody dies, we should know why. The hardest part of this whole case is not knowing why our brother and mom's son is gone." Now, he doesn't believe the stories that were told at the party, saying that they were all different and that nobody could really tell the same story, and so he believes that maybe Kurt had too much to drink, or they had mixed some sort of drugs and alcohol together, and that he had fallen ill and they were keeping him in the basement to try to nurse him back to health, but when he passed, they panicked and dumped his body. And the main question he wants to know is, why couldn't they have just said that? Instead of dumping it, instead of keeping secrets, it would have been much easier for the family to just know that is what had happened. That there was no foul play, that he had just taken too much of drugs or alcohol, or fallen ill and couldn't be nursed back to health. At least they would then know what had happened in his final moments. Dorothy had died of a heart attack, and Kevin said she had never been able to move on, and in fact, when she passed, when Kevin was going through her stuff, he found boxes and boxes of stuff that Dorothy had found from Kurt's investigation, stuff that she kept, questions she asked and got answers to, and just documents and details galore that even the investigators didn't have. Now, Kevin continues to fight for his brother, for his family in general, and he had told the True Crime Chronicles podcast that, for so long growing up, when his brother had been found dead, he believed that no one cared, and he had told his mom that no one cared and that she should stop fighting, and that he now knows how wrong that was of him to tell her that people do care about Kurt, and every single one of them mean so much to Kevin now, and he sees that strangers will be fighting for this case to be looked at and will care about an outcome and a solved case, and that people that don't even know Kurt do care. And he said all this while showing so much emotion and heartbreak, and you can hear in his voice he's absolutely devastated that, first of all, he didn't help his mother when she was alive, which isn't his fault. I think sometimes when you try to push the pain away, you don't want to have anything involving what makes you sad, and so I think that that's such a normal reaction. But I also think that to know people do care and people are fighting for justice when you feel like you haven't gotten it and you're not being heard means so much. And so ultimately that is why I'm doing this case. Now, I had told you that not much of an investigation had been done by the Newburgh Police Department, and this would be confirmed by the Cleveland Police Department, which was a bit bigger of a department, who would ask to get involved years later. When they were involved, they would look at the crime scene photos that showed them that it had not been documented well. There were actually only like 2 photos of Kurt going into the ambulance and on a stretcher, and that was pretty much it from the crime scene. And the duplex had also never been searched by the police, which is why the Sova family had taken it into their own hands. When this case was originally happening, what would be a normal thing for the Newburgh Police Department to do was to contact a bigger police department like the Cleveland Department and ask them for help. However, they never did this, and so the Cleveland Police Department reached out to them and said, "Can we help you?" And they were actually turned away. It would be years later when the Cleveland police detective Al Figler would start to look into this case, because this was on the request of Dorothy, who would send him a whole bunch of documents she had saying that nothing had been done, and so he would begin to look into it himself. When he got the envelope of the case file that was sent to him, it was a very small envelope with about 4 photos and a few pieces of paper. He found the handling of the crime scene by the Newburgh police to be a joke, and he would say that there were missing documents, missing witness statements, or at least they were undocumented, because if they had occurred, they were no longer there to be seen. There were lack of evidence, lack of witnesses, and there was really nothing to this case at all. No one at the party had been questioned by the police, and you could say maybe there wasn't a ton of evidence, and that is why this case file was so small. But when you look at all that Dorothy had, you would see that was anything but the truth. Now, it would also be found that the police department, the Newburgh Police Department, would have some suspicious characters on it, because 10 years later, the lead detective on Kurt's case, who was Robert Carras, would be arrested. He would be convicted in 1991 of 76 counts of aggravated drug trafficking and illegal processing of drug documents, and he was sentenced to 4.5 years. He was of course fired from the police department, and he also pled guilty to hitting a citizen with a flashlight during a drunken driving arrest, kicking another man while he was handcuffed on the ground, as well as pulling another man's hair and striking another man in the face during an interrogation. So all things that he did to abuse his power on the police force. After all this was found against Robert, he was also questioned in Kurt's case to see if he had anything to do with it, and nothing was found. No charges were filed against him revolving Kurt. But Robert wouldn't be the only one who was on the police force at the time that would be being questioned later on about Kurt's death. The police chief at the time, named James Lucas, would be found guilty of falsifying documents for a police dispatcher and was permanently banned from law enforcement. James then was questioned about Kurt's case as well, and when he heard that he was being looked into and people were suspicious of Kurt's investigation as a whole, James actually said, "That's not even fair. What happened was completely unrelated. That's the only part I take offense to. That Sova case was handled on the up and up." Although I'm sure even he can understand why many people would not believe that and would be suspicious of the entire thing. In 2017, there would be information on the Unsolved Mysteries forum that would be from an unknown source, and this would be about Franko. Do you remember the name Kurt called out before getting in the van? Well, this was posted on May 22nd of 2017 at 4:46 a.m. and it read, December 6th, 1981. Craig H. Franko was killed Thursday as he worked at a downtown service station. That is most likely the Franko Kurt got into the van with. There are more apparent connections to Kurt and Eugene's death around the same time period, not to mention that 2 of the Newburgh Heights investigating officers were fired for corruption, and 3 others were killed in a car crash while the driver, another officer, survived but jumped bond and disappeared. 35 years have passed, and while I was only involved after the first, I am one of the 3 boys that found Kurt. I still think about this case and all the loose ends that no one ever followed up on. even though much was reported in '81. Then again during the filming of the Unsolved Mysteries segment. Now, this was obviously, like I said, from one of the boys who had actually found Kurt, or was allegedly to be one of the boys. And it was basically saying that they had found the Franko that Kurt called out for, and this murder of Franko had happened 10 minutes from where Kurt was found dead. So he was obviously still in the area, which is strange that he was never questioned in this case if he was still able to be tracked down. And he was actually 20 years old when he was murdered, so he would have been about the same age as Kurt, meaning he was probably one of his friends and maybe knew where he had gone. But now we can't ask because he's deceased. There was also a $10,000 reward in information revolving Franko's murder because he had been shot to death, but I could not find if his case has ever been solved either, and it seems like this town is really full of crimes and cases that aren't being solved. A year prior to this statement being found, in 2016, there was actually a new police chief at the Newburgh Police Department, and his name was John Majoy, and he had actually been in high school at the time of Kurt's death, and he knew about the case. He was well aware of it, but he hadn't participated in it, so it was completely new to him. And when they were transferring facilities in 2016, he came across all the documents, the very few in Kurt's case, and he would decide that they were going to reopen it and look at it with fresh eyes. He believed that because everyone was so young in this case, that there could still be living witnesses and that this case could be solved. He was also working with a criminology professor at Tiffin College who would be willing to have his students look over all these case files and help out with it to see if their modern perspective of a case could help change the whole investigation. And Kevin, Kurt's brother, was also willing to help out, saying that they could have all of the information that his mother had acquired in her son's case that no one had looked at prior to this. I mean, her notes were very detailed. She had talked to so many people involving this case and kept notes on what they said, what she said, and so many things that could help and were likely to help that no one had even looked at before. And it wasn't for lack of trying. She had tried to have the investigators look at it, tried to give it to him, and they didn't do anything with it. The new chief admitted that the previous investigators didn't do a thorough job, and that even if this wasn't a murder that happened to Kurt, that somebody still dumped his body there, and they needed to find out who and what had happened prior to that. He believed that with everyone's help, this case could still be solved, and so 39 years after Kurt had been found, it would actually be taken to an event called CrowdSolve, which is a portion of the huge, massive CrimeCon convention. And this is an annual true crime convention that I'm sure many of you know of or have even been to. And this year it was held in Chicago at the Hilton Palmer House from February 21st to February 23rd. Basically, anyone who feels a connection to these cases or who just wants to help out or wants to get involved and pretend to be a detective for a while, they can go. And it's so much more than that. You can talk to investigators, you can talk to victims' families, you can talk to YouTubers who do true crime. There are a ton of different events and things to do while you're there. And they decided that because so many were wanting to get this case solved and that fresh eyes could really help, that they would have this CrowdSolve event where they would bring in all of the information they had about this case, and they would let citizen detectives or citizen sleuths go and investigate this case as though they were the top investigators and would come up with their own theories. They were able to talk to the investigators of the case that were actually in law enforcement. They were able to talk to Kurt's brother. He attended, and he was so happy he did because it reminded people that Kurt was a real victim who had a real family and that Kevin wanted answers. And so it kind of gave them that extra push, wanting to get it solved, not just because they could say they solved something, but because it mattered, that it made a difference. When Kevin stood up and thanked everyone for their hard work at the end of the day, there was not a dry eye in sight. He really has the ability to show his gratitude and his pain and how he's healed and his beautiful personality. This event was to kick open the reopening of the case, and they figured the perfect way to do so was to get more people involved. It wasn't necessarily for the publicity of it, it was to get different eyes actually on the case files. One of the guests there was Selena Gomez herself, who had gone with her mom just to help. Obviously she's interested in this sort of stuff, and she was said to be very attentive, taking notes, giving her own opinions, adding things in, and taking it very seriously, which is what you're supposed to do there. And Kevin Sova himself was actually sitting right next to her and had no idea. And you know, I'm only talking about Selena not because she matters more than Kurt. I think it's beautiful that Selena was using her time and her money and her mind to go in and help try to solve this case and get this boy justice. And without even knowing, Selena researching this case caused a huge eruption of media sources basically talking about her investigating this case and getting the news out there to more people about Kurt. You're wanting to know about his case, how you can help, and it just is such a beautiful thought that it can bring more exposure and more help to these cases. I never want any of you to think that because you don't have a platform, you don't matter. Because that's actually the exact opposite. Every time you share, every time you learn, every time you help with one of these cases, you are also such a big component in it, and you're making a difference without even knowing. Because, I mean, without every single one of you, I wouldn't even have a platform that would have these cases reach thousands of people, because you guys wouldn't be watching and it wouldn't be recommended to more people. And, you know, it takes every single one of you, and that is your power. But basically what I'm saying is I think it's cool that Selena was involved in all of this, and, you know, she is the reason I even heard about Kurt's case, and maybe many of you as well. Yeah, I'm happy to bring you his case. I'm happy to know about it, and I do hope that it gets solved soon. Kevin, Kurt's brother, says that he just wants to wrap his arms around anybody who helps, and that he loves them, that he appreciates each and every person who helps. But he also says he wants families like his to be helped too. He doesn't want all the attention on him. He wants it to be for every victim that hasn't gotten that justice. So if you have any information about this case, please call the Crime Stoppers hotline at 216-252-7463 or the Newburgh Heights Police Department tip line at 216-386-0024. And let me know, would you be more likely to click on a case that says the Kurt Sova case or the Selena Gomez investigated case? Because it's hard for me. It's a fine line between clickbait versus getting no people to click on it at all. You know, I think I've seen the difference in people clicking faster when I do the more in-depth titles rather than just saying who the victim's name is in their case. But I don't want that to take away from the victim at all. However, I think if I can get more people to watch the videos with a different title that is, you know, spicier, because it's not necessarily clickbait, I think, you know, getting more people to watch is beneficial as well. And so I really struggle with that, because I never want to come across as using these people for their stories or for more likes or more subscribers, because to me that's not even it. It's that more exposure equals help in these cases or shedding light on the victim's stories. And so to me it's like, where do you draw that line? Where do you make sure that you are still getting them, that you're still treating them correctly and like humans and not like an entertaining story? And so I really hope I didn't offend anybody by this title, and I hope that I still did Kurt's story justice and his family justice, even if it was a little bit of a dramatic title. That's what I would call them, just more dramatic titles, because I'm never going to say anything in the title that isn't true. So I'd love your opinion. Okay. Don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay. Bye. cat. Caesar. Caesar. Oh, look. Look at the sweet boy. Look at the sweet boy. Oh. Oh. You wanted to say hello?